take home the golden gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With you is the editor-in-chief. That's me. My name is Irina Tsukaman. For those who are newly joining the program, today's topic is a new project, a new initiative dedicated to highlighting and bringing in the Christian voices to Abraham Accords. It's referred to as Abraham's Missing Child. And it's a project of the Philos Project, which was founded by Rob Nicolson, who's our guest today. Rob, in addition to being the founder of the project, is a lawyer, he's a Marine, a very interesting person. We've had guests from the Philos Project before, but it's a huge undertaking and it has many components, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss what it is and some of its work that we haven't had a chance to highlight before. Welcome to the Washington Outsider. It's great to be talking to you finally.
It's very good to be here. Thank you, Irina. And what a great title for a podcast. It's excellent.
Thank you so much. So Rob, tell us, how did you end up being a lawyer with a military background, ending up founding a nonprofit organization, the Philos Project, and ending up being active literally all over the world?
Well, it's a great question. I'm still trying to answer it. I'll do my best here. I grew up in upstate New York, in Buffalo and in Syracuse. I was born in LA, didn't live there very long, and grew up in a working class family. Christian family, but I myself was never really that interested in Christianity, and certainly had no connection to the Near East or the Middle East. It was not on my radar at all. It's upstate New York are Irish, Italian, Polish people just working in factories and things like that. I started my journey when I left home about a couple weeks after turning 18 years old, when I joined the Marine Corps. Like many young men who enlist in the military, it was mainly because I wanted to get out of town and travel the world and do something interesting. Didn't really know what I was doing. Ended up in the aviation side of the Marine Corps, worked in aviation operations, was stationed in Hawaii, of all places. People always ask me about my combat experience, and I have to explain to them I did more surfing than combat, but the Marines is the toughest branch and the best one. And so that experience, I think, really, prepared me for all the work that I would do. It changed my thinking. Obviously, like most young men, I was convinced I knew everything in the world. The Marines told me I knew nothing and what I was not important whatsoever. That was exactly what I needed to hear. And I think also being in the aviation side of the military allowed me to think about the world, right, globally. And that was a big part of my job. So it was a very formative experience, but it didn't really tell me what to do next. Ended up in college, was trying to find my professional path, but along the way was also trying to find my personal path. And I'll spare you the details, but ultimately ended up discovering faith. Christianity became very important for me. And crucially, that journey was through the back door of Judaism, strangely enough. I began to become intrigued by the historical side of Christianity, in addition to the theological side, and was kind of obsessed with where this religion came from. And of course, that led me to the Jewish people. Obviously, Christianity is not Judaism; it's an offshoot. One could say a heresy from a Jewish perspective, but obviously these two faiths have common roots. So I went to a local synagogue in Syracuse, New York, and began to study the Hebrew language and meet people in the Jewish community. And one thing led to another. And this was, I should mention, between 9/11 and kind of the invasion of Iraq shortly thereafter. And so I was connecting the whole time this faith journey, which had kind of led me back to Jerusalem or back to the Near East, with events that were taking place in the media. And I just began to ask myself, ask people, what is the connection here? What does Christianity have to say about things today, right? It's not just something that happened 2,000 years ago, but what does it have to say about Islam and about Israel and about indigenous Christian communities that I had never heard of up until that point, that are still living there, still living in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and all these places. And I basically started from there, from that one thought, and ultimately through a series of events that I won't recount here, but found myself in a position to start a new project and it's kind of reframe and rethink the region and re-engage from a Christian perspective and bring other Christians from different sort of denominational backgrounds together in community to do this work.
When you started the Philos Project, what was exactly, what did it start with exactly, and what are its parameters now?
So in the beginning, so I took a fellowship with a think tank called the Tikva Fund, where I actually met. I kind of entered your world, Irina. That's a story we won't tell on the air, maybe. But I was there because I was this weird Christian guy who knew some Hebrew and was studying Jewish Christian relations at the time. As you said earlier, I was a lawyer. I had just left law school, and my plan was to become a lawyer. But I took this little detour for about a year. And that year led me to another year working for a Jewish philanthropist as a kind of a researcher. And my question was, what is the state of Jewish Christian relations? And also, what is the state of relations? It's a similar but different question. What is the nature of the relationship between the global Christian community and the Jewish state, the state of Israel? What are views on Jews? What are views on Palestinians? What are views on the conflict and the solution? And so this was my project. And so I went really deep and traveled all over, talked to old people and young people and evangelicals and Catholics and of course Jews and Muslims as well. And I had this idea. My idea was there needs to be a new generation of Christian engagement with the Holy Land and all the people who live there. Of course, Jews, because of our connection, first of all, but also Arabs, and of course, as Christians, with the Christian communities there as well. So my original mandate in founding the Philos Project was to kind of relaunch Christian engagement with Israel and the wider Near East, and to do so from a regional perspective. So there are a lot of people who work on Israel issues or conflict issues, and there are a lot of people who would work on, say, the Christian communities of the region or Christian Muslim relations, but nobody had ever brought all of those things together. And so my hope with Philos was to bring these different threads together and to tell a bigger story. Because look, you can't talk about Israel if you don't also talk about Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt, right? These are all connected. And so many Christians, I think, like many people, only see Israel. They don't actually care what's happening in Syria. It's for them, it's not relevant. Who cares? Bashar al-Assad, yeah, he's a bad guy, but I'm thinking about Israel. What are the Jews doing in Jerusalem? That's a typical way that the people in the world think about the region. And I wanted to bring it all together and to connect the Jewish issues with the Christian issues and to reframe it. So a crucial part of this is the name of the organization. So Philos, people are always like, what the heck? What is that? Philos? What does that mean? Philos is a Greek word. In Greek for Christians is obviously special because the New Testament was written in it. Greek means friend. So when most Christians, especially over the last 20 years, think about this region, they think of enemies, right? Terrorists and jihadis and all of this. True, there are those people, plenty of them, but there's also a lot of friends. And people don't realize that, right? They don't understand that there are friends not only in Israel, but in other parts of the region. And I guess we'll probably get to that. And we wanted to tell that story, right? To talk about how things can change. And this was before the Abraham Accords and all of that stuff, right? And sure enough, I think time has proven the concept that we started with. But it's very unusual for people when they first encounter it because they're not used to talking about this part of the planet in positive terms or trying to see hope or anything like that. But we're trying to change that. That's what Philos is all about.
One thing that I always found interesting is how American brand of Christianity, particularly in evangelical Christianity, has had very strong connections to Judaism, to the land of Israel. But in recent years, that has started to shift. And there is increasing talk how evangelical Christianity has started focusing more on internal American dynamics and no longer necessarily sees that connection with the Jewish roots of Christianity as paramount, and reconceptualized its relationship with Israel and with the people who reside there. Has that informed your perspective in the way you approach it? Did you see it as a challenge in trying to build bridges between local communities and Philos and your counterparts on the other side in the Middle East?
Yes, 100%. So yes, a couple of things. The relationship between evangelicals and Israel historically, I'll say a word about that, and then I'll talk about how things have been changing and maybe why. Mm-hmm. So one of the, I'm assuming a lot of listeners know this, but I'll say it anyway. Christianity is broken into different groups, right? It's not just one thing. There are Catholics, there are Protestants, there are Orthodox, and there are a couple of other branches as well that few people talk about. But the big differences that most people know are, especially in this country, are Catholics and Protestants. And evangelicals are a part of the Protestant world. So people try to understand, well, what's the distinction? What makes evangelicals evangelicals? So evangelicals, like Protestants generally, have been trying since the 1500s to reimagine or rediscover original Christianity, right? In the 1500s, there was a belief on the part of men like Martin Luther, John Calvin, others, that the Christian church had gotten off track, right? It had become too wealthy, too powerful, too mixed up in government. It had lost sight of the vision of Jesus Christ. And so the Protestants said the protest that the Protestants made was that the church is wrong. We need to go back to the beginning. And so in the process of going back to the beginning, Protestants and later evangelicals who kind of came out of the Protestant movement go back to where? They go back to Scripture. They go back to the Bible, both not just the New Testament, but also the Old Testament, right? Unlike the Catholic Church, which historically said that, okay, yes, the Bible is the Word of God, but only as interpreted by the church hierarchy, the Protestants said, no. It's just the Word of God. We're going to go back to the Word of God and understand what Jesus wanted us to be. And in the process of doing that, they found this book that had been on their shelf for a millennium that actually was a very Jewish book. And of course, the Old Testament we know, or as we call it, the Old Testament, Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, very Jewish. It's the basis of Judaism. But even the New Testament, and this is a surprise to many people who read the book, all the people who wrote it, whether you like it or not, identified as Jews, and they thought Jewishly. They spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, right? Their thought patterns were very Judaic, and their expectations about the Messianic kingdom, very Judaic. And so as these Protestants and evangelicals came back to that understanding of the faith, and they kind of understood Christianity, its original Near Eastern or Hebraic context, they became very interested in the living Jews, right? And they began to study Hebrew and to try to understand, what is it that Jews believe, and in the post-biblical texts like the Mishnah and in the Gemara, right, and all of these things. So you had these like Christian Hebraists who emerged in Europe and then later in America. And it didn't take very long for those people, or many of them, to latch on to prophecies in the Hebrew Bible about the Jewish return from exile, to return from the four corners of the earth, right, and to return to their land, et cetera, et cetera. And so on one hand, you had them becoming more Judaic in their Christianity. And on the other hand, they began to see a larger role for the Jewish people, even after Jesus. Most Christians believe, they call it replacement theology, that the church comes along and replaces the Jews. The Jews had their chance. They messed it up. Okay, they're out. No more Jews. No, but they don't matter to God in the same way. These Protestants said, actually, no, there's still something like supernatural about the Jews and their role in history. So that's important, and we should support this. You had people like hundreds of years before Theodore Herzl calling for, predicting, anticipating passionately a Jewish return to the land of Israel. So it wasn't a surprise when Herzl and other Zionists began to talk about their ideas. You had Protestants and evangelicals saying, yes, 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 we're with you. And sure enough, with the founding of the state of Israel, some of the most, undeniably, the most supportive people in the world, I would say, have been evangelical and Protestant Christians. There have been other Christians as well, but these guys are sort of the most fervent. However, like everyone else in these modern and postmodern times, evangelicals have been evolving, right? And the next generation of evangelicals, particularly in this country, have different ideas, right? A lot of it has to do with just general cultural change. You see it in the Jewish community, you see it everywhere, right? Young generation is on social media. They're tapping into this kind of ultra secular global culture, and all religion just becomes kind of embarrassing for them. They don't want to be like their mom and dad. That's part of it. But there's also a couple of other things. One is that evangelicals are becoming less connected to the Bible, which is kind of the big thing that they've been known for. Everybody jokes like evangelicals know the Bible like better than anyone, better than Catholics, better than Jews, even sometimes. Like the chapters and the verses and all the characters and what you're sort of raised in it. But evangelical churches have more and more been gravitating towards some of the more kind of instead of like hard textual study, they become much more like positive self-affirmation type services, heavy emphasis on music and cool lighting and great opportunities for the family and for the kids. They become like social clubs, many of them. And so they've lost that very strong biblical understanding of the world. I would say in addition to that, many of them have been influenced by like some of the more radical kind of pro-Palestinian or anti-American rhetoric that's come out not only in America, but in the church specifically, right? And you have some leaders who are, politically you'd classify them as left of center, but theologically have actually kind of turned a lot of things on their head and said, actually, Jesus himself, he was poor, he was downtrodden, he was for the disenfranchised, and if he was living today, he would be for the blank, right? The Palestinians or these, oppressed people or whatever. And it's this sort of liberation theology that has caught on inside the church. So you have many young evangelicals thinking that actually, unlike my parents and grandparents who loved Israel and the Jewish people, I am going to do the opposite because that's what Jesus would do, right? And so they have this theological justification for kind of backing away from Israel. Now, one last thing here is that they don't always tend to be, they don't swing always to some kind of radical, extreme, like total anti-Israel position. They usually, what they do is they kind of become neutral. They'll say things like, look, I'm pro Israel, I'm pro Palestine, I'm pro peace, I'm pro Jesus, I'm pro everyone. I don't pick a side. That's a very common thing in the Christian world. And while in some sense it's not wrong, it's actually okay to want good things for Israelis and Palestinians. I know I do. But the result of that, the effective result, is that these people take usually a very critical position on Israel. And then there's this other part of the church that's very, very critical. And these are the churches you see who are supporting boycotting Israel and divesting from Israel and sort of fraternizing with some of the most radical figures in the anti-Zionist camp. And they're bringing, what hurts me as a Christian is they're bringing Christian arguments to attack Jews, right? For the first time have finally gotten a state in which they can protect themselves. And what they're doing is, of course, Irina, you know even better than I do, they're resurrecting these old anti-Semitic tropes, right? About, the Jews are especially bad, right? They have special sin in the eyes of God. Okay, maybe today we don't say that they killed God, but in some ways we're kind of saying the same thing, right? And of course, it's an embarrassment. It's a shame to those of us who claim the name of Christian. And so we make it as part of our job at Philos to push back on that, right? That's not Christianity in my book. That is not what Jesus would do. In fact, because if Jesus was here, he would be Jewish, right? And he would care about the survival of the Jewish people on their ancestral homeland. Okay, I'll stop there.
I'm going to be a little bit provocative and push back and
Okay.
play devil's advocate right now. And
right.
wouldn't this change in the tradition here among the evangelicals actually make it easier for Philos to connect these Christian groups to Christians in the Middle East and to kind of care more about them in that sense?
Well, explain a little bit more. What do you mean by that?
Meaning, wouldn't it make it easier for the groups here with their rhetoric focusing on the downtrodden, make them more sympathetic and more interested in the plight of the Christian groups throughout the Middle East? This very attitude that's causing a problem for the relations with the Jews in the state of Israel, wouldn't it actually facilitate Philos's work in building bridges between other Christian communities in the Middle East and the Christians in the US?
Great. That's a great question, Irina. And it's a very logical presumption or assumption that you're making. But in practice, while it is true that emotion does actually motivate some of these Christians, especially young Christians, to care about Christian communities in the region, more often, for some reason, one of several things happens. Either they try to drive a wedge between the Christians of the region and the Jews or the Jewish state, right? They will actually say, oh yeah, the Christians of the region, yeah, I can support that cause, but the whole Jews and sort of Jewish independence and sovereignty, I'm against that. And of course, from the Philos perspective, these things go together. I should say, it sort of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. None of what I'm saying implies that the Philos Project, supports every policy of every Israeli government. I mean, that would not even Israelis think that. So that's kind of obvious. But another thing that sometimes happens is that these young Christians who are influenced by some of these more provocative, critical, antagonistic leaders, these voices that are supposedly pro-Palestinian, but are in effect like very anti-Israel, are also persuaded to become more anti-American and even, believe it or not, even anti-Christian. So that you find young Christians who, when approached by me, by us, by the Philos Project, to say, these are your Christian brothers and sisters, you should care about them, they'll say things like, well, actually, I don't want to support the Christians. I'll support the Muslims. The Muslims I'll support, or the Yazidis I'll support, because those are the oppressed, or the downtrodden, or the brown people. There's all these weird things that people say nowadays, right? And Christians, in their mind, notwithstanding the fact that they're just as brown as their Muslim neighbors, or just as fluent in Arabic or whatever, and live in the same exact society, the same exact neighborhood, are, for these young Christians, synonymous with what they see, what they understand as Christian, like America and the West and white people and whatever. So there's often, not always, but often, some reticence to say, oh, I'm for the Christians, because that sounds really hateful and really oppressive in its own right. Like, if we really want to be like Jesus, we'll love our enemies, so we'll love the Muslims. But the upshot is, these indigenous Christian communities are supported by no one, right? Whether they're people on the right, who tend to paint a very broad brush over the region. Not all. There's some of the best advocates for Christians on the ground have been people on the right, but often we'll kind of lump them together with the bad guys. You have people on the left who say, oh, no, I can't just support Christians. I have to support kind of everybody else but Christians, and usually Jews too. So these people, these communities, why we've made them such a priority is because, A, we have an obligation to them as fellow believers, and you, as someone who grew up, Irina, in the Soviet Union, understand the power of having supporters from your community outside of a country. But also, B, because these people are really without a friend. They're super minorities in their countries. They're overlooked often by their governments. They have tried to prove their loyalty to majority Muslim societies without much result. They're getting smaller and smaller. It's weaker and weaker. And they have almost no one around the world supporting them. I mean, if you think about the region, if you're Sunni in Lebanon, let's say, the Sunnis around in the Gulf care about you and support you to some extent. If you're Shi'i, if you're part of the Shia community, obviously we know that Iran supports you. If you're Christian, maybe with the exception of France, which hasn't actually been that helpful, you don't have anybody. There's no supporter out there. And it's the same. I mean, that's not even talking about Christians in Egypt and other places. So Philos has really made these guys key, but also explained that they are part of the same story as the Jewish people. You can't separate them, let alone turn the one against the other, which is what many people try to do.
Now, I'm going to kind of approach this from a slightly different angle, and then come back and tie it all together, and that will bring us to the main part of the conversation. Now, in 2012, 2013, when with the Morsi government in Egypt, we had seen the horrible uptick in attacks on Copts, on the Christians in Egypt. Not that they ever had an easy life there, but it became particularly visible. And then we have seen with the civil war in Syria, a lot of displacement. ISIS came and targeted minorities, including Christian groups in Syria and Iraq, and led to a lot of displacement. What was the reaction of the American Christian groups at the time? Has that changed? And if so, who specifically had become more active on these issues? And I'm curious because I don't recall a huge mobilization of Christian communities in support of those people at the time, other than to condemn the Muslim Brotherhood in very general terms and condemn ISIS just as another terrorist organization.
It's a real frustration that so little has been done on this issue, and I'll state the obvious. There have been many people who've invested their whole lives and sometimes their whole fortunes into this cause and taken it upon themselves to support people, often physically, with money, with all kinds of things, certainly in advocacy. But those people are a very small minority. The short answer to your question is that while a lot was done or was started to be done or restarted among Christians in America, and particularly Christians on the right, particularly among evangelicals and Catholics who are conservative, and you know, people, these are the people for whom faith matters. Although there was some stuff, there was not nearly enough, and there are a couple of reasons why. And people often ask me, why don't Christians do more? I often get that question from Jews, right? You know, citing the Soviet example, like when Soviet Jews were in trouble, the whole world Jewish community mobilized and said, enough. Why don't Christians do that? And it's a great question, because they don't really. So a couple of things. One is the Christian community is super huge. 2 billion people, largest religious community in the world. And I think there's just so much going on in so many countries that a lot of people, you know, lose track of it all, right? There's problems for Christians in Africa, problems for Christians in China, problems for Christians. There's no shortage, right? It's pretty much every country Christians are in. So, okay, they're being persecuted in the Near East. All right, well, that's the latest front. It's not new. That's one reason. Another reason is that it's a general reason that many Christians, many evangelicals, Catholics are not just thinking about the world in those terms, right? A lot of them are socioeconomically just, I don't know, regular people like I grew up with. They don't know what's happening in Egypt. Mohammed Morsi, who's that? I don't know who that is. So there's like a certain kind of disconnection from global affairs among large sections of the Christian community that, you know, we try to fix, but is just kind of endemic to kind of the majority of Christians in America. I think another big thing, this is maybe one of the biggest things, is that it's very hard to advocate for these Christians, because as they themselves, these Christians will tell you, it's very, very easy for us to make it worse, right? If we mobilized in a huge way, if we had a 1 million man rally in Washington, D.C. Against Mohammed Morsi, and push the United States government to do more for the Coptic Christian community in Egypt, it's entirely likely that Mohammed Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood supporters would have actually made their lives much, much worse. Because one of the most frequent accusations that Christians face in the region is that they are agents of the West. They're agents of America. It doesn't help that many of them actually, they speak fluent English and they come and study in the West. And many of them, even in Iraq, for example, when America came in, they became translators, and they started to work with the occupation forces. So they're very, very careful. And sometimes, you know, you talk to them and they say, listen, advocate for us, but just be very, very gentle in the way that you talk about things. And that's hard, right? As an advocate, you want to go big, you want to be brazen and bold and say, no, you know, we need to do something. And what these people tell you is, no, talk about coexistence, talk about pluralism and Jewish or, you know, Christian Muslim commonality. It just makes advocacy kind of, it makes it kind of weak. And then there's the problem that most of what these people need are political solutions. And those, I mean, as you know, it's just in any cause, political solutions are hard to get, especially when you need to get, you know, in the vision of U.S. foreign policymakers. They're not going to prioritize Christians in Egypt. They're thinking hard power. They're thinking great power competition, right? They're just not thinking about religious freedom or whatever. So, you know, I've been in these meetings. You go to the State Department, you go to the White House, and you know, you get the usual kind of like, oh wow, that's really terrible, and yeah, sure, we care about these communities. But at the end of the meeting, you walk out and you realize these people aren't going to do anything, because what are they going to do? They're going to lean on Mohammed Morsi to to do something for the Christians. It's the political side of this is very hard, and that'll probably get into this project we're trying to do. But one more thing before I finish here, and it's actually very Christian specific. So the Christian New Testament has this very inconvenient teaching, and it's pretty rampant. It's not like one place. It's talked about a lot, and by none other than Jesus himself, that Christians actually should rejoice in persecution, right? It's actually good. I mean, it says, rejoice when you are persecuted. And so there's this tension within Christianity between like standing up for yourself, right, and turning the other cheek, and you know, bearing witness with your life or the lack of your life, the end of your life, to the truth of the gospel message. And that, it sounds like kind of a small thing, but I think practically speaking, it's an obstacle for many Christians when you go to a regular church and say people are being persecuted, and what they are thinking is, well, yeah, that's actually part of the religion. Like, and unlike Islam, or certain segments of Islam, which says, yes, die for your faith, but die in a kind of an aggressive posture, right? The Christian call to martyrdom is actually a passive posture. It's like, let them kill you, right? It's not like, blow yourself up, or, I mean, that's a very fringe belief. But I think, for Christians, there's this problem about, well, are we supposed to? And Coptic Christians are a great example. They had the Coptic teaching on martyrdom and suffering is basically, be Christian, bear witness to the truth of Christianity and the gospel. And yes, they may kill us, but that's part of the plan, and we need to suffer that patiently, which makes advocacy extremely hard.
Well, just to again play devil's advocate, I understand the conflict here, and I understand how having a certain challenge, a persecution, it helps in the sense of strengthening character, facilitating recruitment in certain ways, kind of mobilizing people towards their own faith. But let's zoom out for a second and look at the impact of having aggression against any member of the social community on the society as a whole. Yes, as Christians, they may not want to engage in acts of aggression against the persecutors, but on the other hand, is this good for the persecutors? Is committing crimes and killing people going to bring them to heaven from that perspective? Obviously not. Shouldn't there be an effort to dissuade them from thinking in the way that ultimately harms them and the society as a whole, and makes society less stable, brings bloodshed to them, and puts crimes on their conscience? So from that perspective, I think at the very least some methods of persuasion, if not aggression, might be appropriate to prevent sin from being committed in general by everybody. So that's one argument.
That's a great point. I think that's a great argument, and I think we try to make that argument in some ways. One of the principles that we live by at Philos in advocating for this community is doing so in cooperation with those communities, and that's largely what led us to this new project. In that, we don't want to be kind of the ignorant Americans just advocating, right? And people who are disconnected from the ground and from the culture and from the situation. We want to be in communication and representing the wishes of these communities in the way that they want them represented. And I sometimes describe them, people living in these communities, some more than others, as an abused spouse, somebody who is in a relationship that they can't get out of and has for years been subject to very debilitating and humiliating abuse, right? And in public, if you see these Christian leaders, priests, bishops, in a public gathering inside the country, everything they say would lead you to believe that everything is just fine, right? That, then they will say, we love our neighbors, everything's wonderful, there's no distinction, we're all from the same country, no, religion doesn't even matter. But talk to them behind closed doors, just like an abused spouse, and they'll tell you a very different story. And so the dilemma is that while it's true what you say, right, that there's like a kind of a different way to think about this, there's so much trauma. I mean, real trauma. And I'm talking about generational trauma. These people will recount to you how many members of their family have died for their faith, not in their lifetime or even in the last 100 years. I'm talking about in the last 500 years. And so they're inheriting this trauma, and it's so hard to change that just with a persuasive argument. It's very complex to do this work, but we try our best to show them that, look, you have friends. There are people on the outside who can help you get out of that relationship, or preferably make that relationship healthy and much better, not only for you, but for the spouse as well.
And that brings me to the next part of the conversation, which is exactly how are you going about achieving all these things, given these challenges, the challenges of advocating for Christian communities under dire circumstances, the challenges of dealing with Christian communities in the US that are increasingly, for lack of a better word, woke, which is not the same as awakened. People try to make it the same, but it's definitely not. And how does this new initiative play into these dual challenges? What is it about?
So the new project is called Abraham's Missing Child. It was the title of an op-ed that I wrote for the Wall Street Journal last year in February 2021. And the concept or the thesis of this op-ed was quite simple. It was the following: there are winds of change blowing through this region that we've all become accustomed to associating with violence and death and chaos and terrorism, etc. Things are changing. The region's changing. And the most obvious example is this thing called the Abraham Accords, right? And I think your listeners know what those are. I won't describe them. But what I pointed out in the article was that although this is a game changer, right, and is a great indicator of where the region or some of the region wants to go, of this, Abrahamic family, there's exactly one child who's missing. I love that Muslims and Jews are finally agreeing to disagree, agreeing to share the region and to say, look, we're not the same, but we can be neighbors and we can cooperate on things that make sense. I love that. But what's missing is the Christian voice. Where are the Christians? And I pointed out in the article, there's kind of an obvious reason why Christians are not represented in the Abraham Accords. Is because Christians, unlike Jews and Muslims, don't have sovereignty, right? They don't have a country. There are three exceptions: Greece, Armenia, and Ethiopia. But at least two of the three are kind of buried in their own issues. And Greece has historically been, although a bridge between the Near East and the West, has lately been much more kind of connected to Europe. So what I said is that creative ways need to be developed to get Christians at the table, because they, of the three Abrahamic traditions, at least in this region, are the tradition that's most in danger. And so what we've been working on ever since I wrote that article is turning that thesis into a project. And so the project, called Abraham's Missing Child, or AMC as we call it in-house, is an attempt to turn that idea into reality. And so what we're going to do over the next 12 months is have three meetings in three different countries, and we're still working out the details of those, in which Christians, indigenous Christians from the region, different countries, different kind of Christian traditions, meet together with their Muslim and Jewish neighbors to talk about not just what people usually talk about in these meetings, which is sort of this general, we share a tradition, we should love each other, we should respect each other. Okay, yeah, we've said that. What we want to do in these meetings is talk about concrete reality. And at the end of the third meeting, to produce a document, a short document, 1 page, 2 pages, that lists recommendations based on the shared conversation that will, practically speaking, improve the lives of these Christians by not just religious freedom. That's usually how people talk about this. It's religious freedom, freedom to worship. Christians in most places actually have that. They can worship. The other three things that are missing are physical security, economic prosperity, and cultural resilience. Some of these Christian communities are preserving ancient languages, right? Ancient holy sites, et cetera, et cetera. And so we want this to be a holistic set of recommendations that then, and this is maybe the most important part, states, the vast majority of which are Muslim majority, can implement. And why that matters is for the very reason I pointed out earlier. So many of the efforts in the past have failed because they aren't connected to political power. There's no means. We can produce manifestos and statements all day long. If the political powers that matter are not brought into the process, then it's not worth the paper that it's printed on. So from the very beginning, and even now, we're launching this project May 24th. From the very beginning, we have been very intentional, going from embassy to embassy, to invite the members of these governments to the table. Like, help us develop this concept. you all agree, and these are countries that are, either part of the Abraham Accords or part of the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, or who are interested in political reforms more generally, who have demonstrated that they want to be part of the change, right? This Abrahamic axis that's developed across the region. So we're going to the Saudis, to the Egyptians, to the Bahrainis, to the Emiratis, to the Omanis, to the Jordanians, right? Embassy to embassy, the Egyptians, and saying, hey, help us make your country better, right? Improving the lot of Christians is going to also improve the lives of Muslims, right? This is just good for the country. This isn't just good for Christians. The cool thing is, Irina, we've gotten great reception from virtually all of the countries that we visited. Some of them, they have questions, right? What are we signing up for here? What is this project? Who's Philos, right? Some of these countries we haven't worked with before, but many of them, if not most of them, agree in principle. And they feel that this kind of project aligns with where they as a country are trying to go. And that's been really, really encouraging, because when I wrote the article, it was a theory. Now, after having done some work on it, the theory seems to match up with reality. So there's one of the biggest X factors in the project is bringing the indigenous Christians themselves out, the people that we want to be part of this, because like I said, so many of them are afraid, right? That, okay, fine, I come visit your big meeting. When I go back to my country, am I going to be arrested? Some countries, that's a real concern, some more than others. And so for us, getting these states, these governments involved in the beginning is crucial, not only to make sure that the recommendations can be implemented, but so that the Christians themselves feel safe, right? They feel like they have cover, and that their Muslim neighbors, their Muslim leaders want to kind of, work on their behalf and make their lives better. So we've been really encouraged by the response we've gotten. We'll see, the end will determine, whether this project is successful or not, but it's already proving to be really, really like something that brings people together, and people from different traditions, and from the civil society, and also from the state level as well.
So help me understand this better. What exactly is the balance here between civil society and people-to-people diplomacy versus government actions, especially since some of the governments who are signatories to Abraham Accords don't necessarily have the biggest Christian populations. Countries like Egypt and Jordan do have diplomatic relations with Israel, but they precede the Abraham Accords. And then you have countries who have significant Christian communities, very not necessarily indigenous, but but who are not part of Abraham Accords, like Saudi Arabia, which has a lot of Christian workers there, but they're not part of the Abraham Accords. How exactly is this going to work, and how does the government component integrate with the civil society component?
Great questions. These are the big questions. So I'll start by saying we haven't figured them all out. So I'd be lying to you if I sat here and pretended like we have the best answer to your question. I would say that to address, first of all, the civil society versus government, it's important for us to develop to recognize the problems and develop potential solutions among the people in civil society, both Muslims, Jews, and Christians, right? That to start there, because those are the people who see society for what it really is. But also at the same time to be connected to states, governments, so that those recommendations can be implemented, ideally as many as possible. We're very aware starting out that not all of not every state is going to adopt every recommendation. That would be too idealistic, but that as many as possible will be implemented. If we only worked with the governments, the answer we would get is that everything is just fine. Christians are happy. What are you talking about? Why are we even having this conversation? And we've actually heard that a little bit from some of these countries. Like, why is this even necessary? Look, talk to the Christians. They love it here, right? Of course, we know that that's actually not true. So there's a balance, a very delicate balance that we need to maintain throughout the project of really like trying to focus our efforts on the people, on the leaders of the Christian communities in these countries. And on the other side, staying in connection and in friendship with these governments. It's a tightrope. We'll see if we can walk it well. But I think you're pointing out another big problem with this project. And I'll point out something you didn't mention. You mentioned guest workers, which is a big thing. Like take Oman, for example, geopolitically significant country, majority Muslim, but has a larger percentage of Christians than almost every other country in the region, except Egypt, which has the largest. I mean, Omani Christians make up something like 8% of the country, something, but they're all from the Philippines or from India or from East Africa or something like that. So where do they fit? Where do, putting aside the indigenous Christians, where do the current Christians fit?
Mhm.
Our hope, not exactly sure how to do this yet, we're working on it, is to also integrate those voices as well. Because honestly, just looking at the demographic trends, like who will be the largest number of Christians by 2050, it very well could be that the guest Christian population is actually much larger than the indigenous population. In fact, that's almost certainly going to be the case, certainly in a place like the Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula. So that's one thing. But the other thing that you didn't mention, and this is the much harder side, is that a large number of the Christians are on the unfriendly side of the region, on the Iranian axis
I was going
of the
to actually,
region.
that was my next question. What do you do
Okay.
about Iraq, Syria, and so forth?
So look, we have to be very careful. The last thing we want to do at the Philos Project is to make those people's lives worse. I mean, Iraq, you're talking about a very small population, when in 2003 it was 1 million, 2 million, something like that, 3 million. We don't want to make things any worse. Syria, we don't have to even explain the issues there. Lebanon, I mean, once the crown jewel of Eastern Christianity, now a shadow of its former self, and Christians just fleeing in droves from Lebanon, which was, for all intents and purposes, has been for the last 100 years basically a Christian country, or at least has kind of tried to be. So what do you do about these Christians? Not all of these countries are the same. I think there are opportunities in Iraq and possibly in the Kurdish regional government side of Iraq, which is where many of these Christians are, that are more positive, more promising than, say, Syria, right? But even in Syria, right, in the northeastern part of Syria, there is a very old, very ancient historic Christian population that, because of different governance, because of what's happened in that part of the country, is maybe a little bit more available for this kind of conversation. But in other parts of these countries and in Lebanon, it's very hard. So the best that we can do with those communities is deal with those representatives who want to be part of this, who feel that they're willing to take a risk, or maybe feel like they have friends in their local governments that can give them cover, or for their colleagues, their co-religionists in the diaspora. So, for example, in Lebanon, obviously mostly Maronite Christians, huge Maronite population in the United States. So are there things that we can do for the Maronites in the US that will kind of reverberate back home and give hope to those Christian communities? We're not going to force it, right? We don't want to make things worse, but we do want to try to think creatively about how to help them as well. And here's my hope, is that government of Iraq, maybe some of these other governments, see the value, right? And actually, for maybe other reasons, because they also want to be, they want to change in terms of society, in terms of politics, and are willing, maybe not enthusiastically, but at least tolerantly, to entertain the idea that it is good to help Christians. And when you talk to these leaders, even if you talk to very, very conservative, traditional Muslims who you might otherwise think would be very anti-Christian, almost all of them will say Christians are an important part of our society, right? Now, do they mean it? Are they being cynical? I don't know. But it's a very common talking point that these societies are best when they're pluralistic, right? When it's not just 100% Muslims. So that desire and that confession, when you talk to these people, I think should be try to turn into reality. Like, take them at their word and say, okay, that's great. We're happy that you love your Christian communities. Like, help us help you help them. And we'll see if we have takers. It's hard, but we're going to try.
Two last questions. How do you see this effort as being to bring on, do you think, thanks to the kind of pluralistic nature of this project, this kind of, new evangelical and whatever else other churches, do you think they're more likely to join this sort of effort? And if not, what is the argument to kind of push back against their current position? And the second issue, what role do you expect Jewish and Muslim civil society participants to play in this effort? How do you think they could be helpful?
I do think that we're going to get more interest from Christians. Again, even among like very good Christians, there's some kind of hesitation to only helping Christians. It's weird. It's a quirk of our faith community, right? It goes back to Jesus and him, talking about the Samaritan and whatever. So the fact that we are from the very beginning of this project bringing in non-Christians, Muslims and Jews, I think will be attractive for a lot of Christian churches wherever they fall politically or generationally. I think that's going to be appealing, right? Because it's comprehensive, it's holistic, it's about neighborliness, which of course is a big thing we talk about. With respect to, and by the way, I will say one other thing. So a piece of pushback we might get is people saying, well, what about Palestinians? Or what is this about? My answer to them is, look, this isn't about normalization with Israel, right? I'm pointing out the Abraham Accords because that's the most obvious example of a changing region. I would love for Christians and Muslims, as many as possible, to just agree to live beside the Jewish state. I think that's a pretty small expectation. I don't see why anyone should be against that. I think that the more of that we have, the better. Normalization is a bad word, tatbiya, right, in Arabic, but it's a pretty general concept, right? It just means that you've gotten used to your neighbor who's different from you. So I'm very pro. Let's, Christians, Muslims, everybody, let's agree to live beside this thing called Israel. But I think we're going to have some Christians who say, oh, you guys are anti-Palestinian, or nonsense that we hear. And what I would say back to them is absolutely not. This has nothing to do with that, A. And B, to the extent that there are Christians who identify as Palestinians or Arab Israeli, they're also part of this too, right? I mean, the Holy Land is not excluded from this conversation. Israel and its Christians needs to be, in many ways, front and center. So if anything, it's the opposite, right? This is perhaps the best way to leverage changing regional dynamics for the Christians in the Holy Land that you supposedly care so much about, right? Now, with respect to Muslims and Jews, I would say the sky's the limit, right? The more Muslim and Jewish cooperation, collaboration we have on this, the better. The good news is that there have been, as I'm sure you know, a number of different documents, particularly in the Islamic world, supporting religious freedom. I mean, even, His Majesty King Abdullah in Jordan, right? What he did in the Amman Statement going back to the early 2000s, the Marrakesh Declaration, or the statement on human fraternity that just came out of Abu Dhabi a few years ago. There are all these statements and manifestos and like building on that momentum, that crucial work. People came before us and did that work. That's hard work. But in the meantime, there are supporters. Sheikh Mohammed El Isa of the Muslim World League loves this stuff, right? He loves the idea of coexistence, and what he's doing with the Mecca Declaration, and some of these other things is key, I think, to all of this. So the more partners we can get, the better. This is a collaborative project. Okay, Philos Project is leading it. We're kind of the catalyst for it, but our goal is to make this thing successful, which means bringing in as many Muslim and Jewish partners as possible. So anybody out there who's interested in collaborating and be part of this coalition, and it is a coalition, please get a hold of me, robert@philosproject.org. I would love to receive your email. And for those of you who are just interested in general in Philos and kind of what we're doing, philosproject.org. We have all these social media channels. You can keep up with us. It's a big, as you said, Irina, it's got many different faces, different gates. There's all these different projects. Some of them you've talked about on this show, and we're grateful for that. So the chances are that listeners, if they're interested in this subject more generally, they'll go on our pages and find something maybe that's especially interesting because of their own background and interests.
Thank you so much, Rob. This was an extremely valuable discussion. Now that this initiative is launching with a press conference, with a panel discussion of fascinating speakers, and with this official effort of the first part of the series of meetings that you mentioned in Washington D.C. to be followed by future international summits. Let's hope that it will bring more than just discussion points and resolutions, but tangible, practical projects that the participants can develop and work on after these meetings, that they can take in their own way and in their own directions and bring practical benefits that will convince others to join on board and launch partnerships that can continue in between and beyond these three meetings that you have mentioned, wherever the future meetings happen to be. I certainly look forward to watching how this develops, what direction it will ultimately shape and take, and what happens with the internationalization of this effort and its regional kind of broadening of its scope. I certainly want to see what impact it will have on countering these negative dynamics that we discussed earlier in the program. I certainly hope that more people will see that simple narratives are never the right narratives.
Amen. Amen. 100%. Thank you for those well wishes, Irina. I'm grateful that you had me on this program. It's really fun to talk about it, and thanks always for your support and all your work.
Thank you so much, and I certainly hope for future iterations as the program develops and as different things happen. Best of luck with everything. Wish you the best of success. And for those who've been watching the program, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week at our usual time, 9 p.m. Tuesday evenings. And for those new to the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, and please stay tuned for our future programs.